Today, I'm shooting The Prince by Machiavelli. So, if you've ever heard of a person who's called Machiavellian, which I had before I even knew that it was an actual real person, then you'll know that it means something approximating morally corrupt, manipulative, something of that type. Definitely a negative attribute of personality. So today I'm going to break it down. I'm going to do two sections for the general viewer. It's basically going to be main themes and the structure of the book, which is pretty simple. The text is actually not hugely complicated. Like if you see this, about half of that is either the introduction in the Penguin version. There's also a translator guide. And then there is a glossary of proper names that they put at the end where they basically explain. He keeps referencing historical people, and they explain those. So about half of that text is not even the actual main Prince text. So it's not a huge book. I mean, it kind of looks big on camera than it is, but it really ain't. And the pages are not exactly like chock-a-block text. It's very simple language. It's actually quite easy to read for something written so long ago and translated. So it's not a hard read. So I'm going to do those two sections, and then I'm going to kind of explain the context afterwards, which is more you would only want if you've already read the book yourself or you're studying it in some capacity, at uni or high school. I don't know why they'd have you study it at high school, but I don't know. Maybe there's an adventurous high school out there that's doing it. Cool. So I've made some little notes here so that I don't forget. Main themes. So the first one that I really picked up on when I read through the book the first time was the use of violence and, I don't know how to explain it other than morally bankrupt methods. Definitely not things that in the 1400s, when he wrote this, pretty sure it was 1400s, otherwise it would look silly. In the 1400s when he wrote this, they were very Christian, obviously. It's crusade time. And so there was no leaders who would simply come out and say that they would do many of the things that Machiavelli describes people as doing in this book, and even recommends that you do. So one point that he has is that showing an appearance of certain virtues is actually more important than having that virtue. And in some cases, the virtue itself is actually not a good thing for a leader. So this book there's different people who think of it in different ways, but the most straightforward read of it is that it's advice to a leader. It's called the Prince, but it more translates to a leader. Because in England, you have princes who don't straight up become leaders, which is what this is intended for. But so, for example, he does generosity. And a king who's too generous and gives everything away and doesn't hoard wealth in any capacity will then have to increase taxes in a famine or in a war, which is when everyone else is already strapped for resources anyway. So then they're going to have to try and take more stuff to pay for whatever's going on. And so Machiavelli makes the point that some of these virtues you can't really afford to have as a leader. Which is interesting. Most of his things are very realist, and some people even think that this book is satire and all that, but I'm all going to that sort of stuff in the context. But a point he definitely makes is there's some virtues you need to be seen as having, and there's some vices that it's okay to be seen as having. For example, being someone who is frightening and violent is not the worst image to have, especially in these times as a leader, because then people are afraid of you. So the next is short periods of quite excessive or vivid violence, and even treacherous violence, one example he uses. The way he kind of talks this off is it's okay to be cruel for a short period of time. So as you're entering power, you completely eradicate the previous nobility or power structure. But you do this for a short, transient period of time. And how he justifies this is that the general population is not really affected. You only killed the wealthy people who were kind of keeping them down and ruling them. But you've taken away all of the options by killing off 30, 40 people for a civil war, for people to go home and build up their little area, the equivalent of a baron or a duke, to put together a militia and come after you. So the way he justifies it is that you're being preemptive, you're stopping a problem before it occurs, and overall the average people are going to be happier because they're not going to get caught up into another conflict, which is a very convenient ideology to have when you're the leader doing it. But that's kind of the thing. He has this view that if you keep it short and vivid, then you won't have to keep doing it. But if you go in trying to be nice and maintain the previous power structure, then as each challenger kind of comes up, you're going to have to keep getting rid of them. And that's going to give you a worse reputation for cruelty and violence because it's ongoing. And the fact that other people are trying it means that more join the side, so you actually end up wiping out more people. So he is completely okay with treachery or whatever, just to get it out of the way and to keep the overwhelming population happy. He's very preemptive with his violence and with his deal-making. So one thing he talks about is with his alliances, you always ally with smaller people against bigger people, because if you ally with someone bigger, even if they're trustworthy then, once you've won, there's just the two of you left there. If you think of it like a Monopoly game, if there's just the two of you left there and you're the second biggest player, you're almost certainly going to lose because you're just going to land all the little squares. But if you help all the other little players until the number one player gets toppled, and you go from number 2 to number 1, then you can go around and just try and wipe out all those little players. But until that time, you don't want the room or the territory that you're joint invading, which is something he brings up, to be just you and someone bigger. Because the moment that they change leadership, or just look at your side of the territory and go, well, that looks good, they're going to make a play for it. He also justifies a lot of his violence and bankrupt methods as it can be justified as it's better for the country. Kind of came under the short periods of violence, but sometimes lying can be better for the general population. For example, the government won't say certain things if they think it's going to cause a public panic, which could cause a negative impact comparable to the thing that they're reporting. So we already do know an element of this. Oh, and the last is to use patriots and not mercenaries. Something because of the times, the country he was for was very small, but they were reasonably wealthy, so they always had mercenary armies, and he basically talks to the problem of using those. I thought that was interesting because in businesses, you have the espionage thing, and it kind of... It is comparable to today's world of not to use mercenary armies and, assassins and all of that sort of stuff. Like, it is kind of a crazy area and topic. Another theme that he keeps talking about throughout the book is statesmanship and warcraft. He seems to view it as you want to have good laws, good institutions that you set up, and a good military. And if the military isn't loyal to you, you replace them with a better military. And in this example, he doesn't actually generally mean to wipe them out. He believes that states ultimately are linked to their military power. And that if they don't have a military power to back up what they're saying, at the end of the day, if push comes to shove, the other side can always use violence, and they have a reliable army and you have an unreliable army. So he talks about that quite a bit, and he talks about different types of states and different types of armies and mixing mercenary forces and auxiliary forces and using other people's troops, all of this stuff. But I really felt like it boils down to that. He believes that you should instill good institutions, good laws that don't bother the average person. He has almost like a weird libertarian streak throughout the book where Don't tax the average person too high. Just kind of leave them to do your thing, and then you can sit there and be on top. Goodwill and Hatred. You'll kind of see that this is where the consistency of what he says comes through. Some people claim that his writing is not very consistent, but goodwill, he says, is nice to have. But if you're hated by your population, it's a fatal mistake. There are very few people who can be hated by their populations. And one example he talks about is whether or not building fortresses or taking them apart is a better idea. Because there were leaders doing both, apparently, at the time he was around. And he makes the point quite clearly that no matter how many fortresses you build, if your particular population that you're leading is against you, it will not save you. You're completely screwed. Goodwill is nice, but you almost don't need people to 100% like you. Especially at first. It's okay if they're mostly afraid of you or afraid of what you'll do. And again, if you leave them alone and have good laws and good countries and they prosper, you're really not bothering them too much. And yeah, sure, you killed off the guy who used to own the lands and titles to this area. But since then, the last 5 years, you haven't done that much. That's what he kind of plays up. You don't necessarily need goodwill, especially for shorter periods of time, but you cannot tolerate being hated and having riots and all of that sort of thing. He also speaks on free will. So it's interesting because a lot of the people are very religious at this time. He kind of sees it as a compromise of the things that you do personally and the circumstance. He also explores, doesn't really command you like in other sections, how an aggressive temperament in this environment is a winning lot for leadership. It's exactly what you need. And then in this over here, it's patience and being calculating that will win it. So that's kind of where he sees the luck elements coming in, and he seems to think that people have a basic nature that they can't really change, or have a limited ability to change. Overall, he seems to favour an aggressive, more impatient, more forceful leadership style. He has quite an amusing metaphor for that I won't repeat. So he has a compromise between free will and determinism. Doesn't really make the argument ever, which is unusual for writings at this time, that if you do the right thing, God will make sure things go well. He very much sees it as human factors and political factors at the time. And he studies a lot of examples. He uses a lot of examples in his writing. He will look at Caesar, Mark Antony, just all these different historical figures, even some that I've never heard of before. Virtue. He more defines virtues as qualities that are praised by people. So again, it's more about the perception of the virtues that you have. So if everyone says that you're religious, that's good enough for being religious. Whether or not you actually are, you don't know. And I suppose even he, writing this, doesn't actually know what people honestly think. He points out that you should try to appear virtuous more than be it, especially if it's on something that gets in the way. And that there's a certain amount of vices and particular vices that you're allowed to have, and it won't really affect what you do. But that can also come down to the free will kind of section where it is to a degree luck. If you're in a particularly religious time, it's different than if you're in a more decadent time. Human nature is probably the last theme that I'm going to look at. He thinks that there's a certain number of traits that are inherent in particular people. So temperament, that sort of thing. And I have found that that's at least partially genetic. But also that a crowd has a certain human nature. And that people will normally make self-interested decisions overall. Their affections and loyalties can be changed, but there is reluctance. So he kind of studies the nature of the crowd. And that they're content and happy as long as you don't do anything terrible to them. They'll kind of leave you alone if you leave them alone. But if times get tough, if there's no fear involved, they won't really come through for you. He seems to view it as a more fear-based leadership survives when things get tough. which is interesting because the historical evidence kind of suggests the opposite a lot of the time. If people think they're going to get wiped out either way, in my opinion at least, it seems like they turn on a leader that they really dislike. But it's hard to know always exactly what he means. Oh, and that because of human nature, a leader is required to do certain bad things because of the nature of the crowd. The crowd simply doesn't reward certain virtues actually being held. Alright, structure. So how am I doing for time? 16 minutes. Alright. So the book doesn't follow any type of narrative structure, and it isn't super regimented in the way that it's laid out. It does generally break concepts into chapters, but more the arrangement of those chapters isn't rigidly adhere to any kind of structure. But I'm going to go through this nice and quick. The intro really gives the scope and purpose of the book. It's almost like an essay's intro in some ways. And you'll notice from this immediately that he makes a lot of interesting and very strong statements. Because of this, this must happen. This will always happen. He makes very absolute statements. He then goes into how to maintain captured territories. And he talks about, this is where you start to see, for example, I'll just break down this one as a little bit of an example. He talks about how if you take over a new territory, but you don't live there, and you put people into rule, you're much more likely to lose the territory. If you go and move there yourself, it'll be good. How similar the territory is to yours in culture affects things. And if you're not going to live there, then you should set up a little colony. And the reason he gives for this is that it's inexpensive and that you're only going to displace a small number of people rather than if you put your army there and displace a lot of people. And the people you've displaced now are like homeless, so they can't do anything to you to get revenge. Which is another theme I should have mentioned before, is that if you're going to use force, you should use it overwhelmingly, because if you only use a little bit, the other person's still strong enough to get revenge. But if you obliterate them, they can't get revenge, and if you're not willing to do that, then you should pretty much just leave them alone. Which is a mistake I think that a lot of people make. I don't think it's always true, but yes, that was a point that I got from this book, and I kind of thought about. It's like, yeah, there's a lot of conflicts that you just shouldn't get into unless you're willing to take it to quite a high level. Like if someone's being physically aggressive and you're not willing to hit them and knock them out, you're risking taking that conflict to a point where, you know, you push the guy, he pushes you, now he swings but you're not willing to swing back. Well, then you shouldn't have pushed. You should have kept things just in that verbal range of talking smack. Then he moves next chapters. I've basically just grouped these into arcs. Practical advice for a leader. And this moves through a lot of different topics. I'm not going to list them all out, but things like how to do certain type of alliances, which I went into before. And interestingly, he's a fan of democracy, which almost seems at odd with his comments on human nature of the crowd will not necessarily come through for you with their goodness, but people will come through when it comes to their own survival if they think that there's real danger in not coming through. On the properties of leaders and leadership ideals. So this is kind of coming up to the end now. He talks about what the leader should be like, and he uses a lot of examples of leaders. So different pathways to leadership and different ways that different people have gone wrong. He thinks that idealistic policy making makes for terrible government. Very often, and he doesn't state this clearly, but he does through his examples. Even according to the ideals that the person have, they don't measure well if you actually use those ideals when you make the policies. So for example, if you want to feed the poor, the best way to do it is not to spend all of your money feeding the poor, because as soon as something disrupts the government, you now have nothing to actually help them when it matters most. Simple example, but there's a lot of ones like that where he kind of points out how unintuitive it is. So the best way to prevent future violence, for example, is to be preemptively violent and very violent. But then that removes all of the future causes of conflict, and now everyone can just get about their business. And yeah, just keep that overwhelming goodwill of the people and stay strong in your military, because if no one really wants to mess with you militarily, then you're not going to go to war. The last section is interesting because it's where you kind of get pulled back into his time the most. He gives out like a patriotic call to this specific family who, from memory, is the Pope that replaces the Pope that he writes about mostly, and that guy's son, illegitimate son. And he's like a rallying call to unify Italy. He points to disunity and infighting as the reason that Italy keeps getting beaten around by other nations. And it seems like this is where I kind of got my interpretation of the meaning of the book, which was he seems to want a strong leader in this era, even if they're not the most moral, even if they're immoral, to get Italy's pride back. And it's almost like he's given like a dark recipe book on how a leader could go about getting in power and taking over the whole thing. Because I think he sees it as, if the leader followed this advice, then they're going to leave the average person alone, so things will be mostly good. And unified, they won't get invaded as often. So even a leader who's violent in securing their own power and maintaining their own power, which is something he claims leaders mostly do, even if they say they don't, that would be preferable to being, for example, invaded multiple times by France, which happens during his life. So I'm going to move into the context now, and I'm going to try and keep this to the next 7 minutes, but it'll be tricky. I might put some information in text when I can't remember the exact names of people, or there's a particular set of quotes, that sort of thing. So Machiavelli himself was born in Florence. He was a diplomat, and at one time he also worked for a banker, and he had some kind of study in mathematics at some point, which is, you can kind of get that from his writing. He's a very straight shooter, and he doesn't use a lot of literary devices that other writers would use. It actually, to me, makes the book translate well from one time into another, and makes it translate easily from one language to another. And it's very easy to kind of get the point of what he's getting at. Florence was a tiny power in the way of the political landscape at the time. He was a very high-level diplomat, and even on war councils and all of this sort of thing, but the country represented was small and kind of got knocked around. So if France wanted to invade Italy, where Florence was, Florence mattered, but if other people were interacting with other people, their army was nowhere big enough to really make the difference. And they didn't actually keep a regular army, which seems to be a source of his frustration. I feel like some of the book is written to remedy the problems with his own leadership, and also to point out some of the bad practices that actually keep leaders in. I feel like these times are so scheming and conniving. I think even more so today from actually doing this research and on the Crusades, that a lot of leaders go up naive, thinking that's actually what it's like, and they get completely screwed or even killed. And I think he's trying to remedy that to some degree with this book. He's trying to make it an even playing field. And then at other times I feel like it's just venting his frustration. So, the country at the time, there's a lot of political conflict and infighting. There were city-states, nations, and even the church. This is an interesting one. Church fought for political power, fielded troops, and frequently switched sides and changed alliances and went back on deals. And the church, for example, would back this certain army, which would put a lot of money and public support behind that cause. So the church really could influence fights. Blackmail, assassination, playing one side off against the other, and invasion were very commonplace. This entire era is around the Crusades, which carried on to quite a bit later, and people did for career advancement as much as religious reasons. So there are probably some quite non-religious people who went on crusades, interestingly. Italy, where Florence was invaded by France multiple times during Machiavelli's life. These events influenced Machiavelli and his political and diplomatic style. because I think he was very often used to being the smaller and weaker party. He had to rely on his wits and being conniving and playing off this government against this government and this king against this king to actually survive. I don't think he had any way to ever threaten that he could pit his strength against anyone else's. And maybe that's why he inserts certain themes that he does throughout the books. He was a chancellor. At one point, he was on a council of war. He met regularly with Pope Alexander, who, for a pope, was actually infamously political and ambitious. He had mixed political success. Some people will underplay his political ability as they criticize the book because they don't like what's in the book. And others will overplay it if they think what he says is particularly profound. But it seems to be somewhere in the middle. He was representing a small power. He did have moments of success. One guy who he backed, the Borgia, didn't quite make it, but had a period of very high success. And so that was really his life. Now I'm going to kind of talk about what happened to his reputation after, and why Machiavelli means, it's an adjective that means a manipulative, conniving, backstabbing person. Because it's actually quite interesting when you give the nature of the book. So after Machiavelli died, and before he died, his book didn't take off. He wrote other pieces like comedies and a book called The Art of War, interestingly enough. Some of those got notorious, and he did get back into politics and out of politics and in and out. Like I said, he had a mixed career. But this book, The Prince, did not take off during his life. After he died, it took a while for it to be published, and it had to be translated between Latin, Italian, and after a while, English. I think the book was written in Italian, but recorded in Latin or something. I'm not exactly sure, because I'm pretty sure he wrote it in Italian. But then I read later it took a while for it to get translated to Italian, so I'm a little confused. The book was placed on Pope Paul's Index of Prohibited Texts. And I put this little Latin word thing up again in case you are studying. You can reference this. Index Librarium Prohibitorium. Sounds like something from Warhammer 40k. After a cardinal named it as being written by Satan's finger. So this is how upsetting this was to morally fixed and religiously based, philosophical thought at the time. A political opponent of Catherine de' Medici, again I'll put the name up with the correct spelling, who was a daughter of the person that the prince was dedicated to by Machiavelli, brought a lot of Italian literature to court and was quite pro-Italy, which was the main source of her criticism, because, you push this Italian stuff, people have pushed back. One of Catherine's political opponents, and someone that kind of suffered at her hands from the sounds of it, Gentilette, I'm going to put that up because it's probably French, so I probably don't pronounce the T. It was an enemy or someone she injured. She wrote, it'd be the equivalent of like a diss track or a hit piece by today's standards, but at this time it was an essay. Discourse contre Machiavel, which I've heard it called anti-Machiavelli before. And again, I'll put the proper spelling up. And she wrote this against Machiavelli's ideas and what he had to say, and also to Catherine, who she depicted as being an obsessive reader of Machiavelli, and she painted Machiavelli in an even worse light than perhaps he was, if you hate these type of morals, because she depicted him as an atheist, because he said that you use religious appearances in order to get by. And she took some of those things out of context, and, same stuff they do on the news that now. Ironically, Catherine had obviously injured this person or had been a threat to this person at some point, and she needed to either leave her alone or destroy her if you're going to go off Machiavelli's advice. This reputation, which was politically motivated, snowballed over time, so that Machiavellian is now again, meaning manipulative and morally bankrupt. It's actually a dark element of personality. You can do three main bad elements of personality. It's like narcissism, sociopathy, I don't know, and then Machiavellianism, which is really a score again of unfair and manipulative behavior. Many who spread this idea historically reacted to the text that condemned Machiavelli and didn't actually read Machiavelli himself, or did so under a climate where everyone else is condemning it, so they need to be seen to be condemning it also. This came with a period where religious leaders in Europe needed to be seen as virtuous and pure, and so they condemned Machiavelli's work to kind of condemn themselves from those practices, even though a lot of what he chronicles is practices that these exact type of leaders had used historically. It wasn't like he invented a lot of this, he more indexed it and suggested that you do some of it. I mean, I'm not going to lie, he did suggest you do certain bad things. And interestingly, condemning Machiavelli's work is something that Machiavelli's work kind of suggests you should do. And I think this is Machiavelli's main miscalculation in writing this work and expecting to get picked up by a major political leader. Because he says that a leader should appear virtuous and religious, then releases this text which says you should do terrible things. Who's going to hire the guy who tells you, even if he convinces you, that you should appear virtuous and religious and then taint yourself with his bad reputation and his book which says to do bad things? It doesn't really make sense. So people condemning his work is almost them following his work in a way. I thought that was kind of ironically. Interestingly, the text was thought to influence King Henry VIII's decision to take the English church away from Rome. And I'll chuck up the little quotation that I found online now. So I thought that was very interesting. It seemed that the reason Machiavelli was so disliked and got such a bad reputation was partly in pop culture. They started to write characters who were like this. And he kind of admitted what a lot of people were doing, that our culture at the time didn't admit that they were doing. And I think if he wrote this book today, it wouldn't be anywhere near as impactful. I mean, we have a kind of numbness when it comes to people who suggest amoral political things. I don't think anyone expects our leaders to be moral and virtuous today anymore. If you look at any of those polls with the rates of people trusting politicians, I mean, it falls steadily over time. And I think a lot of the criticism of his work was politically motivated by the exact kind of political mechanisms that he points out, and it actually validates a lot of his work. You have people who probably poisoned off this relative and married off this one and went to this pope, and the pope allowed them to get a divorce, which no one else in the country was allowed to do, so that they could then remarry to get this alliance to take over this country. These were all very politically informed people. None of them, there's no possibility that they were all naive and as pure as they like to pretend. What they didn't like was someone coming out saying it. And a lot of them probably did take objection to certain things that he does present in the book, where he justifies bad behavior by the results it has. Whereas a lot of morally absolute people will suggest that, you know, even if you had to kill one person to save two, the killing of that one person is bad. So, anyway, I thought that was interesting. If you're studying the book, the second half will help. If you're not, then I have no idea why you listen this long. See ya.